So this will be, I think, a relatively brief talk. I'll try to make this talk as quick and brief as possible. Basically, I just wanted to present some potential thoughts about the economic implications of AI with a particular focus on poor countries. So you can think of this very broadly as some macro implications of the AI build-out, and then toward the end we'll talk about what that might mean for various countries around the world. So yeah, we'll be simple and short, and then I'll try to leave time for questions and such. So first, I think, as we all know, we're currently in the process of building systems that are currently quite powerful, and in the future, very conceivably, will be very powerful. I don't want to deal with all the annoying definitional stuff about AGI, et cetera. You can, when I say powerful AI or something, you can think of what Dario likes to say, a country of genius in a data center. AI systems that can do a lot of economically valuable things and that can make themselves more powerful, so on. Systems that will have a lot of implications for the world in every way about cybersecurity, biosecurity, the spiritual human role in the universe. We won't talk too much about that. Other people have talked quite a bit about all that. For now, we will focus on a few kind of relatively straightforward economic implications of what particularly the process of building that system will look like over the coming, say, 5 to 10 years. So the first is that powerful AI systems, we can pretty confidently imagine that they will be very profitable for the people owning and or operating them. One way to know this is that very intelligent companies with lots of capital, like Google, Amazon, et cetera, are willing to allocate huge amounts of that capital to building systems with the expectation of very high future returns. You can imagine that systems that can do lots of economically important human work will make you a lot of money if you have them. So people are willing to spend a lot of money to build them. However, the returns to doing this are relatively backloaded in the sense that economies are complicated. Getting huge, massive productivity gains typically takes some time. So this is utilization-adjusted TFP growth. You can think of TFP as, just think of it for our terms very, very, very crudely as productivity. It's not exactly that. Measuring productivity is extremely difficult, but you can see that we've been kind of in a relatively bad period for TFP for a very long time. This is a 5-year average because it's extremely noisy. We had a very good post-war period, and then early 70s, things kind of got a lot slower. We had kind of a boom in the late 90s, 2000s, thanks to IT adoption, et cetera. Things have gotten a little bit better, but still not great. We haven't yet seen much evidence. I mean, it's really too early to tell. We haven't seen much evidence of a crazy increase in productivity, at least from what we can tell from utilization-adjusted TFP from AI. Most likely, we can pretty confidently expect that we'll spend a lot of money right now to build it with the expectation of very high future returns. Those returns will accrue most likely later in the game. Maybe let's say we'll start to see them late 2020s, and then we see a lot of them in the 2030s, perhaps. So, companies like Google, like Microsoft, Amazon, et cetera, will and are spending a huge amount of money. This has already reached kind of a massive scale. So obviously, I think this year, the projected number for the entirety of this year is something like 700, 800 billion across the big 4 hyperscalers, if I recall correctly, which is, so that's like already a lot of money. As a share of GDP, we're kind of, if you look only at the post-1950 period, we are, and only at the top hyperscalers, so not everyone, we're already at like a pretty significant share of GDP. This is if you annualize Q1 of 2026, so we're kind of already above the famous 1990s telecoms boom. If you want like things that exceed this, you would probably look at, World War II facilities on like spending on facilities, like all the infrastructure we built around World War II, and then obviously railroads, where you would have railroad booms that peaked at like 10%, 15% of GDP. But we're already like in pretty historically novel territory. And you should expect that this will only get bigger. I mean, you should expect that maybe in terms of being quote unquote AGI pilled, the C-suite of Google, C-suite of Amazon, there may be some percentage there, but they're not 100% there. They're not, they're willing to allocate a lot of money, not infinite amounts of money yet, or not massive, unbelievable amounts of money yet. So they've started out by spending down a lot of their free cash flow, as you can see. So these were unbelievably profitable companies that have now spent down a lot of their free cash flow in CapEx. Funnily enough, this was reported by the FT a few days ago. Like the analyst estimates believe that they will spend down a lot and then suddenly stop spending and become, again, unbelievably profitable. You can imagine that analysts are also not very AGI pilled, believe that this will be a nice, profitable boom like the cloud boom or something like that, or like mobile adoption, something like that. If you truly do have AGI, you should spend way, way, way more accordingly. You should expect those numbers to get more negative. Any implications you might have about trading, I leave that to you. So in the last 2 years, basically, they have turned to, last year and a half really, they've turned to debt and they've turned to equity in various ways. So in 2025, you saw this boom in debt from these companies that, this is including Oracle, which is kind of its own weird thing. You saw this boom in debt from these companies that historically have not taken on much debt just because Google, et cetera, are just unbelievably profitable businesses that in the past did not really need to take on that much debt. Now they finally have something that they are willing to spend a lot of money on. And then Google, of course, like maybe a week or two ago, did, I believe, the largest equity raise in history. The previous biggest was like Petrobras in like 2010, obviously a very CapEx intensive oil company, raising 85 billion. There's a lot of word that Meta might follow. And this is really like 85 billion relative to how big Google is. It's like 1 to 2.5% maybe. Like it's not a crazy dilution or anything like that. The capacity for their spending is way, way, way bigger. Like these are still companies that can like have massive balance sheets that can, like they can do way more if they really truly believe this is it. This is the most unbelievably profitable thing ever. So like for example, the debt equity ratio for Google, Microsoft, Meta, et cetera, is very, very low. Like these are companies that, again, they're like the greatest companies in the history of capitalism. They have historically not needed to take on much debt. Now they're taking on a little bit. They could take on way more. So like, for example, for the big four hyperscalers, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, to like get the debt equity ratio of a company like Coca-Cola, they could take on another $2 trillion of debt. Coca-Cola is not like a crazily indebted company. It's just like a very normal, successful company. But these are Google, the big hyperscalers are very abnormal, extremely successful companies. And then like, for them to take on $2 trillion of debt and have the leverage parity of the debt equity ratio of Coca-Cola, that's like really not even, like they could take on way more than that. They could take on way more equity. They could take on way more debt. Even things like the dry powder that you have in private credit is not nearly exhausted. There's way, way, way more money that you could channel at this. So one obvious implication of this is that, and this is not new to me, this is something many people have talked about, is that we should probably expect that if we get closer and closer to powerful AI systems that can generate massive, unbelievable profits that are unknown in the previous history of capitalism, you should expect hyperscalers and people who can spend a lot of money with the expectation of getting profits from it to do so. That will probably have the effect of pushing up interest rates in a real way. So, one way to think of this is from Basil Halperin, who's an economist at UVA, I guess a somewhat well-known paper. Basically, like, one way to think of it is like, if you think that you will be much, much richer in maybe 10 years, you'll be 100 times richer in 10 years, saving does not make much sense. So that, maybe saving rates go down. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is perhaps, if you just think like you will make a lot of money from this investment, you should be willing to accept very high interest rates to make that to get the capital to make that investment. So that you should expect that to have the effect of pushing up interest rates in a really severe way. If you truly get to such powerful AI systems, Basil's argument is you should expect like a very sudden and quite discontinuous huge jump in interest rates. So like levels that have not obtained for many decades, just because like if you really do believe in AGI, like interest rates should be way, way higher than they are. This is also Basil's argument for like the markets that are still not pricing in AGI or anything like that. It's just like interest rates are still, they're not like super low, but they're like not nearly as high as you'd expect in an AGI world. So that also would have a lot of implications for the world more broadly. Interest rates, insofar as interest rates are simply the cost of capital, that means a lot of different things about the world. Does anybody have any questions so far, by the way?
Why would interest rates be higher in AGI?
You can think of it in two ways. One is like, let's say I believe that there's going to be so much growth over the next 20 years or 30 years, whatever. I will be way richer than I am right now. It doesn't make that much sense for me to save. It makes a lot, or another way to think of it is like, if I'm Google and I'm Apple and I believe that this thing that I could invest in will have maybe, I don't know, it'll return 300%, I should be willing to accept interest rates of 50%. I don't, like these are totally made up numbers, obviously. But just to say like, you should expect, like, if you have aggressive expectations about growth, you should expect like, you should be willing to accept much higher interest rates. And then Basil has this graph in his paper, basically like, and these are like country year instances. Generally, like the higher the expected growth over the next 5 to 10 years, the higher rates will be. Actually, I'll continue for now. We'll do questions at the end. I'm sorry. So one implication of that is you should expect that interest rates, much higher interest rates, will push up a lot of other things that are influenced by rates, right? Like mortgages, car loans are a classic one. However, if you currently own a house and your mortgage is locked in, asset values are good. I mean, rates have an important distributional quality. Another thing is that a lot of things just will get more expensive. Imagine like we are kind of, again, we're backloading all the ways in which AI could make things cheaper. We are like maybe the factories that run themselves and can build themselves, they only come online in 2034 or whatever. I'm talking about the period between now and 2034. In that period, there will be a very strange, a lot of weird things will happen. It's like, we're already seeing this insofar as like AI is considered to be profitable enough by the hyperscalers that they're willing to outbid other players in the market for various inputs to AI systems. So, for example, memory costs. Like AI data centers use they really need a lot. They really need DRAM, right? DRAM is relatively. It's very hard to rapidly increase the supply of DRAM. There are only three companies that. Three companies own like 90 to 95% of all the market share of DRAM. So you're seeing huge, rapid memory inflation. That is meaning PCs have gotten a lot more expensive. Smartphones are going to get much more expensive, and even cars. Cars, insofar as they use memory, especially like combustion engine cars use some. Electric cars use a good bit more. Autonomous vehicles use a ton. Automakers are already warning about kind of basically, essentially what it comes down to is being outbid for memory supplies by like just how memory hungry AI workloads are. And then of course we're seeing a sort of similar story of component driven inflation with electricity. Anthropic, of course, had this blog post a few months ago about paying for any increases from data centers. And these will generally be concentrated in things where it's like relatively difficult to rapidly increase supply. Of course, you're seeing something quite similar with gas turbines and transformers, although like the trickle down from those into like the energy prices that you might experience as a consumer is a relatively slow thing. So we're already seeing like a premonition of this with like components, right? It's memory, GPUs, all this stuff. But you should expect like a lot more if you expect like the AGI build out to just be so capital hungry that it'll like that it'll kind of like it's like the famous Ross Perot line, this like great sucking sound of like if you have one industry that people with a lot of money to spend are willing to spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars on trying to secure these returns, you should expect like this huge kind of great sucking sound to get worse in a sense. Like one way to think of it is like just in terms of the cost of capital. Before 1983, the way that the U.S. government calculated inflation rates was basically incorporated your mortgage payment. And then 83, they switched to basically how much it would cost you to rent if you own a home, how much it would cost you to rent that home. So not keeping mortgage payments in account. Larry Summers actually published a really interesting paper maybe 3 or 4 years ago, basically trying to explain like, CPI, which is the official inflation measure, is not so crazy right now, right? Why do people seem to experience inflation as being much higher? And basically said, well, if you go back to the old pre-1983 measure of inflation, you actually see this massive increase just because rates doubled in this way that like the housing market was still unsettled. And Larry Summers suggested, if you calculated inflation in the old pre-1983 way, you actually see the early 2020s inflation shock that like was not so crazy in official inflation measures was actually insane by the old pre-1983 ones. And you would expect basically the same thing in a world of like, if real rates are kind of being driven higher by just the massive amount of capital that is being demanded by a multi-trillion dollar, $5+ trillion AI build out, you should expect something similar, and you should expect the AI build out to feel a lot like inflation, in the sense that a lot of things will get more expensive. Another part of that is like industries that are very sensitive to interest rates, like housing, auto. You should expect that it will be, it'll be a lot harder to get a mortgage in this world. Getting a car loan will be a lot more difficult, and then that'll have an effect, of course, on the build out for building out houses and such, or commercial real estate. Same story, especially because they'll also be dealing with component inflation they will be competing with whatever skilled construction trades. They'll be competing with AI build out for skilled construction trades, right? It's like if there's only a certain number of really good electricians who can wire up your office or whatever, they will make a lot more money on the AI build out in one way or another. So in that sense, like you should expect like this one super profitable industry to have a lot of weird effects, or rather this one industry that is absorbing a lot of capital with the expectation of super high returns in the future to have a lot of weird effects on the rest of the economy, which we're starting to see the early stages of right now. This will probably be somewhat weird for the US government because of course the US government likes to take on a lot of debt. We have a relatively aggressive fiscal posture perhaps. In the last year, for the first time since the late 90s, we had interest expenditure from the U.S. federal government went above that of defense expenditure. The last time this happened is because we had this huge decline in defense expenditure, and then also we were kind of still dealing with the legacy of much higher interest rates in the 80s, which I'll return to shortly. But you could expect that in this world where real rates are being repriced a lot higher, the U.S. government, depending on the size, the U.S. government will be forced to accept debt at a much higher rate in the future. So you should expect interest expenditures as a percentage of total federal expenditure to increase by perhaps a good bit. And of course, because of all the term stuff, this takes a while to pay down, just because we were still dealing with the legacy of high interest rates from the early 80s well into the 90s and a bit beyond. But probably this will mostly be okay for the U.S. fiscal position, just because the real issue with interest is really interest or debt interest, whatever, as a percentage of GDP. Insofar as these companies, Google, Meta, et cetera, will be pouring an unbelievable amount of money into building out data centers, you should expect that GDP just mechanically will increase, and unclear if, I don't know, interest like in this world is way higher as a percentage of GDP or whatever, but like probably it will be okay for the US fiscal position. Like it won't be, most likely, it won't be catastrophic. However, of course, other countries also like to take on debt. Most governments like to take on debt. Insofar as you're seeing this build out as it is today, very much concentrated in the United States, the vast majority of data center spend obviously is in the US, much less in Europe, a very small amount in India, whatever, Brazil, various countries in Africa, et cetera. You will probably have poor countries that take on debt experiencing, having to take on debt at much higher interest rates without necessarily having the sort of GDP growth that you see from the data center build out. So probably poor countries will have to deal with a much more difficult fiscal situation in this world. So yeah, other countries will have a higher interest expenditure and they won't really see this like crazy growth that you will probably see in this world in the US. And that's particularly bad for countries that borrow in dollars, because I guess we'll get back to this shortly, but basically it's like if you are able to promise super high returns in the United States, more so than in India perhaps, or more so than in Egypt from AI, we'll get back to it later, but whether or not India has a compelling AI narrative, so to speak, is a difficult question. You should expect to see capital flood out of these various countries, and you should expect to see it flood into the United States. And we've already actually seen this. Like we are very much seeing this already. Basically, the rupee, the Indian rupee, India's currency, has depreciated quite a lot over the last year, mainly because a lot of money is leaving India to invest in basically American AI companies, companies that have some sort of AI story to tell. They've been flooding into all the wonderful growth opportunities in American technology. Similarly, Taiwan and Korea, despite having a huge influx of capital into those countries from the fact that Korea has SK Hynix and Samsung, which have just achieved like almost unheard of profitability or like level of profits among companies. Like even then, the Korean won and the new Taiwan dollar have depreciated quite a lot, just because people in these countries still really want to invest in American companies. America is kind of like the world's capital sink, and you can expect that only to increase. Like that has only become more dramatic in the last few years. In a world of like real AGI, you should expect that to increase even more dramatically. Mechanically, that will lead to a stronger US dollar and weaker rest of world currencies. That makes things much more difficult for countries that borrow in US dollars, which is most non-wealthy countries. The EU countries are able to borrow in euros. China does not really borrow, but like if you are Egypt or Ghana or whatever, you are borrowing in dollars because the people are willing to lend you that money. In fixed income markets, do not want to deal with your currency. They would like to deal in dollars, and so this will lead to like a quite difficult position for a lot of countries that take on debt in U.S. dollars and suddenly have to deal with much higher rates, perhaps without this like strong GDP growth. It's like the phrase that Basil Halperin told me once is a new Volcker shock. So in the 1970s, as you guys probably know, the U.S. had this prolonged, very, very difficult inflationary episode that started with the 73 oil shock, continued because of like various, all this like financial repression, et cetera, that the U.S. was doing, very dumb government policies. It got a lot worse with the 79 oil shock after the Iranian Revolution. And then finally, the Federal Reserve, under this new chairman, Paul Volcker, decided like, I'm gonna raise interest rates to like unheard of levels, like way, way, way above the natural rate of interest, whatever. And I'm going to like really just kill inflation. I'm going to cause a recession. I'm going to kill inflation. That output will finally like decline. We can deal with that. That did work. Like the U.S. did have like 20% interest rates from like, I think it peaked around like 1980 at like, 21% or something. That did cause recession in the early 80s. That was very bad. It did kill inflation, and inflation more or less did not come back until the early 2020s after COVID. But that did also have the effect of like all these countries that, throughout the world that had to deal with, that had been taking on a lot of debt in the 70s for various other reasons, suddenly had to deal with this extremely difficult fiscal situation. So that's where you have the famous Latin American debt crisis of the 80s. Basically, like that is one of the big reasons why this like huge increase in interest rates is why like something like a third of all countries in the world had to go to the IMF in the 80s, because suddenly they had taken on a lot of debt in the 70s and now interest rates were just unbelievably high. I mean, like 20% interest rates are like insane. Many people famously, people like would send Paul Volcker like death threats. They would send him like the construction union famously, like some construction union sent him like a crowbar in the mail to threaten him. A very interesting time. And you could expect, like in this world of much higher real rates from just like how much capital AGI is sucking in, you could expect something similar to happen in non-AGI countries. And then, the other part of this is that basically like, if you are, say, Ghana, what is your, in this world where suddenly the world is kind of, everything is being repriced around AGI, you have very little story to tell. I mean, obviously you have, one part of this is that you have just nothing to do with the AI supply chain. Like, the AI supply chain, you can think of it as like, obviously the United States, Korea with memory, Taiwan with compute. Upstream of that, you have Japan with various like upstream components. You have China with various upstream components, and you have Europe, Germany, Netherlands with various upstream components. And then, if you go bigger, you can say, the UK has ARM. There are companies, but these this is very much a rich world phenomenon. I mean, like building components that have something to do with AI hardware is such a complex process that it is very, very much centered in obviously wealthy countries that are very economically complex. India, for example, has nothing to do with this supply chain. Even a country like Indonesia, Vietnam, to say nothing of Latin America, Middle East, Africa, they have like no real way to profit from the supply chain in the way that Korea, Taiwan, et cetera, are right now. So there's no reason to expect them to like see this like crazy appreciation. And then like, of course, not all of them, but a good deal of them have probably more to lose. This is not true of every poor country, but consider India. India is a country that is a net good importer. So, India does not have that much oil, so it imports a huge amount of oil. It imports all sorts of things, so it has a net goods, a very large net goods deficit. And then it has a quite large net goods surplus, net services surplus. So it exports all these IT services. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the Indian IT industry, which is a several $100 billion industry. So, India offsets its large goods deficit with a large services surplus. It still has a somewhat of a deficit, but a very manageable deficit. You could imagine a world where, like, let's say, unfortunately for the Indian economy, it turns out that one of the first ways in which AI got really good is coding agents. You could imagine that as coding agents get really, really good, Mythos 10 or whatever, or Fable 10, you could imagine that perhaps demand for Indian software services should decline. In that, if I'm a cost-sensitive person who needs software done, I will most likely turn to Claude before I turn to Tata consultancy services or Infosys or something like that. And so you should probably expect the Indian services surplus to decline. And then there's a good reason to expect the Indian goods deficit to increase. If you are an Indian company, probably you want something to do with AI, perhaps. So maybe you buy a Claude Code or Codex, whatever subscription. are importing from an American company. Or maybe you decide, oh, actually, AI is a sovereign asset, very important for us that we have our own AI. In that world, unfortunately, you will have to be importing GPUs from the United States. There is basically no way for these countries to benefit from AI in a way that does not, in some way, involve increasing their goods deficit, in large part because these countries just don't have much to offer in terms of the supply chain. And then, in part for those reasons, but in part for the generally low level of complexity in all these economies, these countries, you should expect them to benefit slower and probably less from AI diffusion, even once we start seeing these crazy gains from AI diffusion, than rich countries. Part of it is right now, just imagine right this moment, if you are Zambia and you're a, 60, 70% agricultural economy, coding agents don't really do anything for you. You should expect, obviously the world trades with itself and things diffuse, and if we invent medicines or, new ways to increase agricultural productivity, that will be good for Ghana, but we should expect, for Zambia, but we should expect those gains to diffuse more slowly and probably overall at a lower level for quite a while. And then more broadly, it's even when we get to the point of factories that build themselves, this world of maybe by the 2030s, 2040s, we're talking about ubiquitous robots that are doing a lot of things for us. In general, historically, poor countries, the advantage that you have if you're a poor country is that your labor is very cheap, and you can export labor-intensive goods more cheaply than other countries. This is why, in the history of manufacturing, there's a famous idea this Japanese economist proposed in the 50s, 60s or something, called the flock of geese. That basically, countries start out as agricultural, poor, labor's super cheap. Then you start making shirts or shoes or whatever, they're basketballs. You get richer, you kind of figure things out, and maybe you go from basketballs, now eventually you're making something somewhat more complex in basketball, perhaps basketball hoops, and eventually, continue on for a long time, and you are making GPUs or something like that. That's essentially what happened in Taiwan, which was a 80, 70% agricultural economy in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and now it is, of course, our beloved maker of leading-edge logic chips. But unfortunately, most countries that are poor today are still at a lower level of that. If Ethiopia or Kenya or et cetera specialize in anything, it is, or have any sort of advantage in the global economy, it is that their labor is very cheap. In a world of automated production, that advantage becomes less and less and less valuable. We've already seen this over the last few decades. This is why the economist Danny Roderick has this famous idea of premature deindustrialization. It's just as production becomes automated, you need more and more capital to be world competitive anyway. It's no longer that advantageous to have a lot of cheap labor. At the limit, you could imagine if I have a fully automated factory that produces T-shirts, there's no reason that a sort of Kenyan factory of relatively impoverished Kenyans will be competitive with me. Maybe they are very poor and they are willing to accept lower wages, but they're never going to be willing to accept lower wages than my robots. And so in that sense, broadly, you should be quite pessimistic about the next 5 to 10 years for poor countries. For the US, it's going to be a very weird thing. We're going to have GDP growth in this AGI world you should expect it to be, it's already higher than it otherwise would be if not for the AI buildout. In a true AGI world, you should expect it to be much, much higher. If in 1 year, Dario Amodei or Sam Altman or whoever announces, oh, by the way, guys, AGI achieved, you should expect that to be followed by the most aggressive build-out of capital, probably at least since the Second World War, I would imagine. You should not expect the AI build-out to slow down after AGI or anything, just because if you have something that is so profitable and so useful, you want much, much, much more of it. And so, unfortunately, this will lead to a lot of weird things in poor countries. However, I should stress, as a broad thing, when the world gets more productive and richer, that is ultimately good for everyone in the world. Even if there are weird bumps and people have problems in the meantime, things are tough. Similarly with gains from trade, there can be people who lose out, especially in locally and for short time periods. However, if we do achieve this world of unbelievably productive AI, unbelievably powerful AI, it will be good for everyone if we don't kill ourselves in the meantime in one way or another. So yeah, there will be lots of weird stuff in the meantime, but the world will be a very strange place for at least the next 5 to 10 years, and hopefully we come out the other end of it happy and safe and sound. Thank you. And then, do we have time for questions or no?
Totally. We can do 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay.
Just call them out.
Vanessa? I'm starting with a safe one because I know Vanessa.
I don't know if that's right to assume. Super interesting talk. I do feel like a lot of the economic impact things that you're talking about is around the AI build-outs implications rather than AI adoption. I'm curious how you think about it. I'll just give the devil's advocate of why the center of my co-expectation of economic impact is a bit less crazy than what you're talking about. I think it's still going to be weird, but two things. One is whether in AI diffusion, well, a lot of this is centered around cost of capital getting higher, and a lot of the presumption of cost of capital getting higher is sort of expectation of return on capital getting higher, right? And you can see two worlds why that might not be true. One is in the diffusion process, you have a lot of the surplus accruing to a consumer surplus versus enterprise surplus. And I think even with the current volume, with the current jitterness in the markets, we could be getting close to a turning point where the expectation of return on capital isn't quite matching the exponential speed on increasing spend so far, even though I totally agree with you, the potential of spend of the hyperscalers is super high. So that's one world. The other world is policy interventions. I think you start seeing dots of the Korean proposal on wealth redistribution, windfall tax, partial nationalization, so on and so forth. I think very likely will come into focus in 2028, which is much sooner than 5 to 10 years. So those are the two most likely worlds in which I feel like the interest rate might not get that crazy, and so on and so forth. So what do you think?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think, of course, this is kind of, what's the famous Leopold Aschenbrenner, straight lines on graphs, whatever. This is the world is a very complex place, and things don't continue forever. There are always countervailing forces. As you say, one obvious one is perhaps maybe one world is we don't get to AGI. Maybe, as Dario suggested in January of this year in this interview he did with Dorkesh, maybe the returns scaling just equilibrate at some point, and they're still good, but they're not insane. And maybe we have really cool AI systems that can do a lot of things, but are not so crazily powerful that it justifies this crazy build out. That's a quite possible world. In that world, then depending on the gradations in that world, things could get very dicey for certain people. Google, et cetera, will probably be fine. Google has so much profit that they will be fine. Companies in this world who have taken on more debt, Oracle would be one, CoreWeave would be another, might find themselves in a difficult position depending on what exactly happens. Right now we're looking at I think 200 gigawatts is the max build out according to Dylan Patel by 2030. We're headed for I believe if I recall correctly, we're headed for 100 or so. For 100, for everyone to make a profit, the cloud layer, the labs, you would probably need on the order of $2 trillion in revenue or so annually by 2030. That is a lot, but not insane. Currently, I believe globally it's something 100 billion, increasing very rapidly, of course. And so yeah, in that world where it just doesn't get that crazy, and just maybe a lot of it accrues as consumer surplus. Maybe people decide Claude Code or whatever it isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Then yeah, you could see things getting, especially later in the decade, things getting pretty dicey. Another version of this, of course, would be maybe the U.S. government, as they perhaps are considering doing at certain moments in the last few months, have been considering doing in the last few months, decide that powerful AI systems are kind of a threat to us for one reason or another. Maybe they empower adversaries. Maybe we don't want Dario Amodei or Sam Altman or whoever to be so powerful, and they decide, actually, we will be nationalizing this, or perhaps we will be putting you in a position akin to that of Raytheon or Northrop Grumman or whoever, where you work for us, you more or less take orders from us, even if you're officially a private company. And also, for political reasons, maybe we would like to take some share of your profits every year. We would like you to, whatever, have some deal where if you do have this world of, crazy growth and automation, et cetera, that causes all this, all these dislocations, that we do not get voted out, or that people don't riot in the streets or whatever. Because of course, you should assume that in this world of AGI, where people are spending with the expectation of crazy growth rates, that does have some implication of dislocation. I mean, economic growth, Joseph Schumpeter would always talk about this, is always dislocation. He would famously say, capitalism is the only system that is constantly undermining itself, and that capitalist growth is always about making old industries obsolete and creating new ones and people moving around. And that's, as a human, that's very painful. If now I used to be a coal worker, now I have to go work in this data center, whatever. That's a joke. But and so you could imagine political interventions or just diminishing returns. Either one of those worlds, and I think honestly, one version of them is something like that is very, 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 very possible, and is perhaps the modal outcome.
Okay. So in this world you described, data centers seem to at least implicitly be built in the United States or other rich countries. Land use and electricity are difficult to secure quickly in the United States, and they want to build extremely quickly. Why wouldn't they be built in, maybe not Ghana, but other poorer countries where maybe they see very large financial returns for making electricity and land available quite quickly?
I would say broadly for the similar reasons why they're currently not being built in Ghana, whatever. Part of it is political. Part of it, Google obviously is an American company, would rather obey American law than Ghanaian law. Part of it is there are actually relatively few places in the world where A, electricity is cheap, B, governance is okay and you're not worried about expropriation or whatever, and C, it's just easy to deal with in general. It's Iceland is one, Norway is another. If I recall correctly, Jane Street has one of their data centers in Norway. You are seeing some of this. Iceland is already a capital of this, thanks to their very cheap geothermal. But in general, most poor countries also have dysfunctional governments that most countries would rather not deal with, and also they tend to have pretty high electricity prices for various reasons. I know you're not talking about Ghana, but Ghana is not an attractive place for data centers. But you probably will see. I'm sure you will see Canada is a pretty nice one, because the Canadian government seems okay to deal with, and electricity in Canada is generally pretty cheap. So it won't only be U.S., but I expect for the reasons as a currently majority U.S., it'll continue to be majority U.S. Especially if you become concerned about, if you're Dario or whatever, national security becomes a top thing. It is very important. Raytheon does not build arms in Canada for good reason, or arms in Iceland. They very much have to build them in the U.S. If data centers are strategically important, they'll do them in the U.S.
All right, I think last one.
Thanks. For the countries that become ridiculously wealthy in this boom, what's their moral responsibility with regard to redistribution of the wealth, and what opportunities do you see for propping up the losers?
I would expect, just as a matter of political equilibrium, the U.S. government. I would be quite surprised to see a world where the U.S. government lets a lot of people be automated and have much worse lives, and then some people become unimaginably wealthy. COVID is the best example where push comes to shove, the U.S. government, we do elect it, and they do respond to political incentives. In COVID, they allocated something 10% of GDP within the order of a week from like one week it was like nothing, and then 1 week they were like, okay, this is really serious. Let's allocate 10% of GDP to giving people money and all that stuff. I think push comes to shove, I would very much expect to see some sort of redistribution. Probably like I think that'll actually be like a relatively straightforward thing, because like even the people in the labs, like Sam Altman and Dario Amodei, at least publicly have said redistribution would be pretty nice in this world. So like, I actually don't think that many people would be opposed to it even. I think that's all.
Yeah, that's good. You can take office hours with that.
Okay, I'll be taking office hours right there if anybody has any further questions. Thank you all very much.